Welcome to the historic village of Sparta, founded in 1813 by Jonathan Doan and his fellow Quakers who settled here. We have made this driving tour to give you a flavor of our village and how much we value its heritage. We will commence with an early Quaker home built in 1837, and we will end the tour with a Quaker home built in 1880. This will give you a chance to see how much the Quakers changed in style. Their earlier homes being unadorned and very plain, and later they were incorporating much more elaborate styles in their architecture. Many of the early styles that we have in the village are colonial style, which the Americans, of course, the Quakers brought up when they came up from America, where they had been living prior to this. They left and came north because of the American Revolution. Quakers were not valued by either the British or the Americans because they were pacifists and would not take sides. So they came north looking for a quieter, settled place to live. And they chose, eventually, Sparta, even though they started in the Niagara region. We are very fortunate in Sparta to have many of our original old buildings built back in the 1820s and on. Many people have kept them in good repair and well maintained, and also many have been repurposed to serve modern day functions. If we have an early photo of the building that you're looking at, we will show it to you while you're at that site. For more information on our history and the historical banners hanging in the village, visit our website at villageofsparta.com. Once you reach the edge of the village, you are able to park if you wish and do the rest of the tour of the village itself walking, but you can also drive it. At the end, you will have to drive again. We also have a separate walking tour of just the core of the village that you can also download to just do the walking of the very core of the village. Let's begin our tour now. We're now beginning our tour at 45358 Sparta Line at the Haight-Zavitz house. This house was built in 1837 by Samuel Haight. The east end, where the French doors are, was added 2 years later. The original, you can easily see the division between that and the original house. This is a very typical house of the New England style. It's a New England colonial style home, which many of the early Quakers or Friends had. It has several entrances on the floor, as you'll note, because every room has a doorway from the outside into the downstairs rooms. The upstairs has 2 sets of stairs because there's no hallway up there either. The rooms open off a platform. There are 2 bedrooms that connect, so you can get from one end to the other. It is a clapboard building. It still has the 12/12 window panes. It has been restored quite nicely in recent years. As you can see, originally it had a beautiful porch all the way around the bottom. The chimneys are still there, and it was originally heated by fireplaces. It now has a furnace in it. The family that built it, Samuel Haight, his descendants still own the house and still live there. And we say Zavitz because one of the Haights married a Zavitz, and so the current owner's last name is Zavitz. It had a kitchen on the back, a lean-to type of kitchen, and woodshed behind, which is no longer there. This house is a perfect example of a simple styled Quaker home. There's nothing fancy on it. Everything on it serves a purpose, and that was very much the way the Quakers believed at that time. We will now move down Sparta Line to the Rundle House at 45865 Sparta Line. Now, the Rundle House, the Rundles were an early family, and they actually were a Quaker family. And this house is built in the 1880s, which is very typical of the Italianate one. You'll even notice the railing around the top, which is no longer there. But you can see the porch is still there, the windows, the brackets under the eaves, and it is now a home of 2 families. So one lives downstairs and one lives upstairs. The Rundles were a very prominent family at the time it was built, so it's very typical Italianate and a lovely home that has been well preserved. We're now going to move on to the Quaker Cemetery. It's at 45868 Sparta Line. We're now moving on to the Religious Society of Friends burying ground at 45868 Sparta Line. It's right across from the Rundle House. Now, this was the original site of the first Quaker meeting house built in 1820. And Jonathan Doan, who was the original settler, who's the one who came from the area of Niagara, the Quakers had left the American states during the American Revolution, and they had moved up to the Niagara region at Sugarloaf, which is now Port Colborne. They had moved up there because they were pacifists. They would not fight for either side, the British or the Americans, and consequently, they were not popular with either, and many of them were driven out. Many of them had their lands taken away from them, their farmland, and some were even tarred and feathered. So they fled and came up to live in Upper Canada at the area down in the Niagara region. During the War of 1812, the Americans were attacking in that area, crossing the river, and so many of the Quakers felt that it was going to happen to them all over again, the same thing. So Jonathan Doan, who brought his grandson, Jonathan Steele, who was 9 years old at the time, they came down by flat bottom barge down Lake Erie to Kettle Creek, cut up across country far enough inland. They hoped they were away from the access, moved to the east away from the creek, originally bought a piece of property in Union, but then exchanged it for a property here where this Quaker cemetery sits. This was the original part that he bought a 200-acre piece of land here. And he set up a tannery in the back on the creek. And he also set up the first sawmill and grist mill down in the village of Sparta. Quakers believed very strongly, as I say, in pacifism. They didn't fight. That was why they didn't take sides. They believed strongly in education. So the first Quaker meeting house was built on this site at the west end in 1820, and school was held in that Quaker meeting house. That was also the school as well as the meeting house. They also believed strongly in the equality of women. The early ministers in the Quaker meeting were all women because they felt women were better at settling arguments, helping people in need, and making sure people were looked after. So that they had women ministers. Sarah Haight, who from that previous house, Sarah Haight was the first minister in this community, and later Serena Menard was the minister. Today, they do not have a minister. This is a typical cemetery. If you notice the stones, they are very plain. There's nothing fancy about any of the stones. Most of them just have the name, the date of birth, and the date of death. Some don't even have that. There was a rebellion, which I had mentioned before, and Joshua Doan was the son of Jonathan and Jane. And he was married and had a small child, but he took part in the rebellion and, of course, was hanged, as I will tell you later. And he is buried here, and we have a picture of his grave. It's just in the main entrance. If you go in and go to the right, to the back area, back by the scatter garden, you will see the graves of Jonathan and Jane, the original settlers, and their son Joshua. Many of his brothers and sisters are buried here as well. There was a plaque put up by the province of Ontario to recognize this Quaker settlement at Sparta, and that plaque is still there. That gives you some idea of the Quakers, and they really had a tremendous influence in the settlement of Sparta. Sparta remained a Quaker settlement exclusively only till 1820, and then the Methodists and Baptists started moving in. We are now going to move on to the house and cheese factory at 46062 Sparta Line. Well, welcome to 46062 Sparta Line. This is the house and cheese factory, and you're looking at the house now. This house was built in the same style as the Haight Zavitz house that we visited earlier. This one was built about 1870, and it also has the door entrances everywhere. And it has the piece on the left end was the kitchen. The bake oven and fireplace are still in that part of the building. You can see a picture of it, what it looked like earlier on, but you don't see that particular part. But it always had these 4/4 windows, which tells you it was built later because those window panes didn't come into use until the 1860s. This was owned by the Canbys. Originally, they were the cheesemakers of Sparta, and then they eventually sold it to the Donnellys. When the Donnellys owned it, there was a fire in 1911, and they had to rebuild it. We will now look at the cheese factory. The cheese factory was built originally in 1871, and it was burned down in 1911. There was a fire, and consequently, it was rebuilt by the Donnellys in 1911. and it functioned as the cheese factory until the 1950s. At that time, most farmers around here went out of having dairy cows, and it was converted by the Littles, the current owners, into a canning factory where they did both asparagus and tomatoes. So it was the Little V Canning Factory, and there you have a picture here of both the factory as it exists today, which their son repaired it and fixed it up so it looks lovely, and you have a picture also of the 1911 factory. We are now at 46083 Sparta Line, which is the Sanderson House. This was built originally by John Kipp, an early Quaker, or Friend, because they call themselves Friends, not Quakers. And it was purchased by Robert Lyon Sanderson, who was a doctor in 1859 after his home and office burned in St. Thomas. Dr. Sanderson was attending a medical convention in Tillsonburg, Ontario for the weekend, and when he returned home, his home was gone due to the fire. So he purchased this home in Sparta. The Sanderson family, owned the house until 1990. And this house was remodeled by the Sandersons in 1924 in the Greek Revival style, adding the portico and pediment and pillared entrance. They also added the room to the right. The original part that built by John Kipp is on the left-hand side of the house. And it was, because he was an early friend, it was built actually in 1820. And it was where the Quakers met before they got their first meeting house built. We will now move on to the Baptist Church at 46170. We are now at the Baptist Church, which is now a home. On October 31st, 1869, a frame building was opened for worship. They were a missionary branch of Plains Baptist Church, which is just up Sparta Line. And Reverend Alexander MacDonald, was the first minister. In 1894, the building was raised in 1894, and a basement was hand dug beneath it, and 2 years later, it was bricked over the surface. People arriving by buggy alighted on a platform and then tied their horses in the sheds at the rear. The platform was removed in the 1990s, and the sheds have now been replaced. It is now used as a home and it had the windows and doors replaced recently. We will now move on to the Mud Cottage at 46173 Sparta Line. We are now at what we call the Mud Cottage. It was built around 1830, and it's made from adobe, and it's done in the Regency style. Now, the adobe is clay, only instead of straw, which we have a building further down that has straw in it, it actually has horsehair as its binding feature. A Regency style building features a recessed door in the center, and this one has casement windows. That means they open from the center out, they pull in, and the outer ones, the shutters, opened out. Of course, it now has storm windows, so that doesn't work. The only light in the upstairs room was the lantern as you can see, at the top of the house. The walls originally were between 1.5 to 2 feet thick, and they are faced with oak paneling on the inside. You'll notice the front door is recessed in, as I said, and has side lights to allow light into the hall of the house. It was also heated with stone chimneys. You'll see other fireplaces in both sides of the building. That was how it was heated. And you'll notice the carriage house to the right at the back. We will now move on to 46211 Sparta Line, the Hiram Smith House, Ridgeview. We are now at Ridgeview Farm, a Ridgeview house. This is the Hiram Smith House. It sits a long way back from the road, so it might be a little bit of a challenge to see the house. It was built in 1865 by Hiram Burley Smith, who was my great-grandfather, and it's where I live to this day, and it has been in the family since it was built. It's a Georgian-style home with Regency details. So the front door is recessed by a foot, the same as the Regency doors, but it's Georgian in the sense that it has a center hall and is equally balanced on both sides. So this is what they call a 3-bay Georgian, because it has 3 sections. You can tell that it is a later period by the size of window panes, because these are 6/6 and quite large. But it also has the light, it has a transom light that is arched in a Roman arch, and it has side lights along the door to give light to the hall, because the hall inside is 12 feet wide. Hiram Smith was, you'll see his tailor shop, etc. later. This was his second home that he built. You'll see the earlier one further down. It also has beside it a brick building that houses a smokehouse, a brick bake oven, and tile drained toilets. These were used with lime put down them to allow them to be continually used instead of an outhouse. The windows, as I say, are 6/6, and that tells you that it was built in the 1860s, because that's when that larger pane. And the reason that is the roads coming into Sparta were plank roads with wood. And so it was a very rough ride coming to Sparta. And the only way to get glass here was to bring it in wagons packed in sawdust. And the smaller the pane, the more likelihood of it surviving. So as the roads improved, they were able to bring bigger panes of glass. So you will note when we get to further houses, the very small panes, which tell you that they were built in the 1830s or 20s, when it was very difficult to bring glass in. We will now move on to the Enright House at 46239 Sparta Line. We are now at 46239 Sparta Line, which we call the Enright House, who are the current owners. This house and the house to the left of it were built one in 1854 and one in 1855. It was part of the Hiram Smith estate for many, many years, and the hired man and some of his sons lived in this house. My father was born in this house. Note the pilastered doorway on the gable end, and note that the gable end is facing the road. You'll see the doorway has fake pillars or pilasters with a heavy entablature above the door and side lights, which is very typical of a Regency-style cottage. You'll also notice that the roof has soffit and fascia and what we call end returns, very heavy end returns, which is very typical of the period in the 1850s. You'll also note that the window panes now are 6/6, but quite a bit smaller than the ones up at Ridgeview, the previous house, because these were brought in the 1850s, and the Ridgeview was brought in the 1860s. So the roads, as they continued to improve, the window panes continued to enlarge. We will now move on to the one next door, which is 46249, the Baptist Parsonage. We are now at the Baptist Parsonage. It is no longer the Baptist Parsonage, but was for many, many years. This house was built in 1855, and you can see again those 6-pane over 6-pane windows of medium-sized panes of glass. It also has side lights on either side of the door, but someone has painted over them inside. So the glass is still there, but it's painted. You'll notice the pilasters on either side of the door as well, and you'll see the heavy entablature above the door. Note in this one, it's easy to see the designation sign. We have several designated buildings in the village of Sparta, and this is one of them. This house faces the road, the side faces the road, not the gable end like the house next door. This house has an interesting story about it. It's also clapboard. Both these houses are clapboard, which is overlapping wooden boards with a heavy soffit and fascia. In 1901, the Baptist minister, the Methodist minister, and the doctor formed a temperance society because alcoholism had become a major problem in the village of Sparta. And they purchased the last bar. 3 of the bars closed voluntarily, but the last one wouldn't. So they purchased the bar and closed it on its last night at midnight. Of course, in those days, on Saturday night, midnight was when the bar closed. And the men in the bar lit torches, marched down Sparta Line, going to burn this house down and pay that minister back for what he had done. Only the doctor, Dr. Shannon, had caught wind of what they were planning, and he was sitting on the front porch with a shotgun in his lap. So all of the men changed their minds, put out their torches, and went home. We know about this because the son of the minister, Mr. Baker, His son was a professor at the University of Guelph, and he was 5 years of age when this happened in 1902. And he saw the men coming from his bedroom window and was terrified that his house was going to be burned down around him. He came back and told that story in 1968 at the anniversary of the Baptist Church when I was a teenager, and I'll never forget him telling the story. And we will now move on to the Salt Box House at 46268 Sparta Line. We are now at the Salt Box House at 46268 Sparta Line. This house is a very old New England style, featuring 1.5 stories at the front and 1 story at the rear, with a long sloping roof that goes back there and a short roof that comes to the front. If you see it from the side, you'll realize this looked exactly like salt boxes that they used to keep on their table, because salt was a very precious commodity for preserving meat. So this is a very early style of house, but this one had a fire. It was probably built in the 1840s, but there was a fire that destroyed the windows, so all the windows have been replaced in this house. It's also been covered, as you can see, with aluminum siding, and it had the original 12/12 window panes, but no longer due to the fire. The fire damage occurred in the 1980s. We will now move on to the Dominion Hotel, which is 46251 and 46253, because the Dominion Hotel was one building originally, but was separated. This is one of the hotels that closed voluntarily when there was the problem with alcohol in the village. It also served as the doctor's office before it was separated and converted into these 2 homes that the Gorvett brothers owned. We will now move over across the road to the Sparta Continuation School at 46272 Sparta Line. We are now at the Sparta Continuation School. This school was built in 1927, and it was a real innovation for the community of Sparta. This was designed by John Finley, a famous local architect. It had 2 classrooms. So all the grade 9s and 10s were in one, and all the grade 11s and 12s in another, and 2 teachers taught all the subjects. But it meant at least that rural kids got some high school education. If not, they all dropped out and went to work after grade 8. So many of the communities around here did not have continuation schools. My husband attended this continuation school and then went on to grade 13 in St. Thomas. I did not attend it. This school, though, is now the Sparta Community Hall, and it is well used by many, many groups, and we very much value having it. You'll notice that the inset just below the flat roof, the gray area, that was originally a beautiful cast 3-pointed. We had to remove it and just put in a plain cement border there. The school closed in 1963. What happened was they had registered teachers throughout the whole time, properly trained. In fact, my husband's mother was the first teacher in this school, one of the 2. The 2 registered teachers both retired in 1962, and the school board hired 2 totally untrained people who had no teacher's qualifications whatsoever to teach here. And I'm afraid all the students who stayed there for that year lost that year, and they all had to repeat that year when they went on to high school in St. Thomas. We are now at the early Hiram Smith house at 46277 Sparta Line. This house was built in 1842. Hiram, when he first came to Sparta in 1830, was 19 years of age, and he lived with James Mills and family, and he eventually married Sarah Mills, one of James's daughters, and they built this house in 1842. Unfortunately, Sarah died about 4 years later. They had 3 sons. The youngest was 5 when she died. He then married his second wife and had 11 more children. This was later owned by his son, Hiram Jr., who also ran the store next door, which was Hiram's original store. In the beginning, he did have his tailor shop in this house. That is why it has 2 front doors. The left door went into the tailor shop part, and the right went into the home. And now we will move on to the Hiram Smith store, which is on the corner of Sparta Line and Hiram Smith Lane. The Hiram Smith store that we are now at was built in 1846 as Hiram's tailoring shop. He also sold yard goods from this store. His son Hiram Jr. continued the business until 1904. This building is designated, and it's not just designated on the exterior, it is also designated on the interior main room because it has the pressed tin ceiling, the original shelves from when he sold yard goods, and the original counters with the inlaid brass yardstick in the counter and the cash box they used when they used it as a store. Please note the fan light at the top, which is a very typical Greek revival feature, and the heavy eave returns and the dentelles under the eaves. The windows are, again, 6/6 windows that are double sash, so they move up and down. We are now moving across the road to 46316 Sparta Line and the old, what we call the Forge and Anvil Museum. It was originally one of the 4 blacksmith shops in the village of Sparta. And it is very unique because it was built in 1827 of clay and straw. They built it, they dug a pit, they had oxen trample clay with water and mix straw in, and then they pounded it into forms about 2 feet wide. They would only do so far up, let it dry, then add more. And when they got to the height of the windows, they just inset the windows and kept pouring around them. You'll notice that the rafters actually protrude right out. There is no facer boards, etc., but you'll see the actual beam rafters coming out of the building if you look. The original doors, of course, were diagonal boards like a double opening barn door. Now, this building is very important in the village of Sparta because in the Mackenzie Rebellion, or the Rebellion of Upper Canada that occurred, the rebels that were here, Joshua Doane and Charles Lawton, were the leaders, and they never were involved in any attack in the beginning because they were going to Victoria for a raid and to the Scotland area, what they call Scotland now, but the militia caught word of it and they aborted and fled to the US. Most of them just gradually drifted back and were never charged with anything, but Joshua Doane made the mistake of attacking with the Americans at Detroit. The rebellion was in 1837, then the Americans attacked Windsor in 1838. Joshua was captured, soldiers had been killed, etc. So he was tried for treason in the city of London and hanged. And it took the Quakers over a month to get permission to bring his body back, which is buried in the Quaker cemetery that you already saw. This building is now our main museum and has been in the public hands since 1944 when the last blacksmith closed. And my grandfather, Edgar A. Smith, bought the building from the last blacksmith and donated it to the Women's Institute to preserve because it is the oldest building in the village of Sparta. We will now move on to the oil house right across the road at 46328, and that's the home of the blacksmith who worked here. John Oil was the blacksmith who worked across the road in the Forge and Anvil Museum. He was the early blacksmith, and this home was built in 1838. And it's a perfect example. If you look at the window on the left front or under the porch on the left, you will see the 12 panes over 12 panes in the window sections, which tells you it was very early on. Glass was not made as plate glass at that time. It was all hand blown. So it also had to be small. Even up until the 1860s, where they have much larger panes, they are still hand-blown glass, not plate glass, which didn't come in until the 1870s. This house, then John Oil's house, is a typical Quaker-style home. The original windows up above had 6/6 window panes, and the ones below 12/12. There was a fire in the right-hand side or the west end downstairs, and the windows at the front were destroyed in the fire and consequently replaced in the 1870s with much larger plate glass windows. And it's typical of a Quaker home because it had no ornamentation. The Quakers in the 1830s built very plain, serviceable homes. Nothing was on the home that wasn't usable. So there was a purpose to everything. It obviously used to have shutters because that was how they kept the cold out in the winter. We will now move on to the Abbey across the road, which is at 46324 Sparta Line. We're now at the Abbey. This house was an extremely plain home in the beginning. As you'll see from the old picture, the door wasn't in the center, and it certainly wasn't a fancy pilastered door with an arch light above it. That was added by Peter Robson in the 1980s. This house was built in the 1840s, and the only newspaper ever published in Sparta, called The True Teller, was published in this building. It was full of grammatical errors, etc., and was mainly a gossip sheet. It also served as an inn where people could stay. It was a furniture and coffin shop at one time when the Modingers owned it. It is also has been now an art gallery, but they moved that next door. It was also a girls' school, a finishing school where they learned to sew and proper etiquette and how to write nicely, etc. But it was an apartment building in my youth, etc., and very plain buildings still with an outhouse. It didn't get washrooms until the 1970s. This house then was moved originally. It used to sit right beside the Sparta House tea room, and it was moved over to the west. The Modingers owned it, and Amelia Modinger lived here. The Modingers were the early casket makers, furniture maker, and runner of the hardware. We will now move on to the tinsmith shop or metal shop at 46341, just across the street. It was built in 1840, and it's where the early pioneer, you'll see if you go in the Forge and Anvil Museum, you will see some of the things that were made there, like candle molds and early coffee pots, etc. So this is what it served as in the beginning. And then later it became the butcher shop. And when it became the butcher shop, they added the ice house at the back behind it. And that was the ice house. And that's where they cut ice out of the pond in the winter. They dug, it goes down 6 feet below ground level. They put sawdust under it. They put ice on and layers of sawdust and more layers of ice and more of sawdust. And that would last literally the whole year as a way to keep meat cold. You'll notice that the construction is board and batten. It's also got a boom town, which is a false front. A boom town means it looks like a 2-story building and it's only a 1-story with a false front to make it look taller than it is. If you wish to see the tools that were used there, the ice cutting saw, tongs, are over in the Forge and Anvil Museum, and the Fishleys, the Butterwicks and the Fishleys, were the butchers of this location, and Bill Fishley was our volunteer for many years at the Forge, and it was his father and grandfather and great-grandfather who were the butchers in the village. We'll now move right next door, and this is the Israel Doan House. We are now at the Israel Doan House. Israel Doan was one of the sons of Jonathan Doan, the original settler, one of his younger sons. And Israel lived in this house, and the piece on the west or right-hand side was added later. You can very clearly see how it was added later. The center part of the house, the main part on the left with the veranda, looks very much the same as the Baptist parsonage, and you'll see another house. There's 3 houses, other houses in Sparta that all look very similar. And Israel actually built all of those houses. So Israel lived here, and this one was built in 1845. So it's the earliest of all of them. And Israel, he was the constable in the village, and he was also the caretaker of the meeting house because he was very much a Quaker, and it has the pilastered door in the center as well. We are now at the Temperance House, an unusual name, but I will be explaining why it's called that. This was built in the 1840s by a Mr. Hitchcock. It was originally the Sparta Hotel, and in 1851 it became called the Elgin Hotel or Elgin House because we were part of Middlesex County or Middlesex District at that time, and it was in 1851 that they split Elgin off of Middlesex, and Elgin became a separate county. In 1872, it was renamed the Ontario House, and it was owned by Freeborn Taylor. Now, it was Sparta's busiest hotel and bar, and alcohol had become a major problem, as I mentioned earlier, and all the other bars voluntarily closed except this one. So the Sparta Temperance Group got together and purchased this building. And as I mentioned before, that was headed up by the Baptist minister, the Methodist minister, and the doctor at the time. And this is the hotel where the men lit torches at midnight and marched down the street to the Baptist minister's house intending to burn it down. And as you know, the doctor met them on the veranda and they all, with a shotgun, and they all left, and nothing ever happened. This temperance house has had many uses over the years. When they first purchased it, they set it up with a reading room and an ice cream parlor, and they even held dances there at one time. They were trying to give people other things to do besides go to a bar and drink. They raised the money by publishing cookbooks, and my great-grandmother headed up the committee, and her daughter-in-law, who were both Mrs. H.B. Smith, and they headed up the committee and published 5 cookbooks, which you can see copies of in the Forge and Anvil Museum, and that's how they raised the money. And they were some of the earliest cookbooks published in Ontario. The Temperance House is now a spa and a shop with apartments above. Notice that it originally had a double veranda. In the old picture, you'll see now they have just a porch, like, or platform all the way around with a ramp up for accessibility. But as you can see, it originally had this beautiful double veranda, and beside it was originally the stable for this hotel. So people had a place to keep their animals if they stayed. We are now moving on to Sparta House across the road, which is the tea room at 46342 Sparta Line. We're now at the Sparta House Tea Room, which is what it is called today. Now, this was built by David Mills, a Quaker, in the 1840s, and it served as a hotel. He built it in the American colonial style, which, of course, many of the Quakers came up from the US, and they brought with them many of the American styles. It features a double veranda with classical proportions. Note the dentals up under the eaves. Those are little square blocks, very typical Greek feature. It also has heavy eave returns and a boomtown on the end. And you'll notice from the old picture, the boomtown and that part was added later. That wasn't there originally. The lower part was there originally because that was Louis Modinger's coffin making shop. And he was the undertaker as well as a carpenter. And that was not unusual. That was very common in those days. It has a clapboard siding. It housed the first library in Sparta. It was Millman's General Store. It was a furniture shop, a funeral parlor, a hardware, a barber shop, a trophy shop, and now is a tea room. It was in very derelict condition in the early 1970s, with none of the verandas still there, and it looked like it hadn't been painted in years when it was the hardware. And I will give credit to Michael Roberts, who bought the building, fought hard with the municipality to be able to open it as a tea room, had to put steel I-beams in the basement in order to make it structurally sound. And he was the one who took an old photograph and replaced all the verandas exactly as they were originally. And so he deserves a lot of credit. And to this day, it still looks that way and is maintained now as a tea room. We are now moving on to the bank across the road at 46355 Sparta Line. You are now in front of the bank at 46355 Sparta Line. This was the bank in the early days as well, and as you'll see from the old picture, it was a vertical board building with a boomtown on the front in horizontal clapboard, and that was when it was the Sterling Bank of Canada. Eventually, they replaced it with the brick building, which was also the bank and has 14-foot ceilings. But the Sterling Bank of Canada went through some tough times and eventually they went bankrupt in the early 1900s. And then eventually it opened up, and it was a predecessor to the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, but it closed as a bank in Sparta back in the 1930s. It was used as an apartment home for quite a few years with very high ceilings, but it has a unique basement like a vault. You'll notice the pilasters and the pediment, which were Greek features when it reopened as a bank. But it is currently owned by the people who own Anything Used or the Sparta Candle Shop across the way, and they use it as a warehouse. And now we will go over to the Aiken store, which is now Sparta Country Candles. And that is just across the road at 46316 Sparta Line. The Aiken's General Store was built, the back part of the building, you can see from the older picture, the back part was built first because we needed a post office. And Sparta got the name of Sparta because of this post office coming, but I will tell you that later where Sparta was named. The Henry Yarwood owned the building, or built the original building as the post office at the back. And you will notice it had 12 over 12 window panes. So it was built very early on, probably in about 1840. And it is of the small handmade strawberry brick. The front part of the building, though, was built in 1846, and the Aikens built that. And the Aikens ran this as a general store in the village. It is very similar to the Hiram Smith store, where the yard goods, etc., were sold, but the ceilings are much lower, and the countertops were in there. One of the original countertops is partly still there, but the rest are gone. You can actually go back into where the post office used to be at the very back. Eventually, they moved the post office up halfway up. And so if you go in the store, you will see on the right-hand side, as you go back past the main room, you will see a little room on the side, and that was the post office for many years. The Oils bought the store from the Aikens, and they were all those Henry Yarwood and the Aikens and the Oils were all Quakers. And Eric Oil and his son ran it for many, many years, and his son Norman took over and they ran it. When they finally closed, it was bought by Mike Roberts and turned into Sparta Mercantile. And that was and then eventually the post office was moved down to the general store. You'll notice that it's very similar in style to the other building, but it does have a flat front with the doors just coming out at the center, whereas the other one had the doors recessed in with display windows coming out on either side. This is a very popular shop in the village of Sparta. Note that on this building, the front porch has a scooped roof. It's not just flat, it actually comes up. All the buildings in Sparta, if you'll notice, all the early buildings had this type of scooped awning, and it was to keep the water away from the foundation when it rained. There were no eave troughs, so the water came down and it shot out away because of the scooping rather than just falling off the edge. We're going to now go down south of this area. We're going down to the Sparta Church Museum and Manse, which are down at 6089 and 6073 Quaker Road. We are now down at the Sparta United Church Manse, or Methodist Manse. This was built probably in 1885 or 86. The church was built in 1886, and we know that the manse was built slightly before that. If you look at the old picture, you can see that we still have the porch as it originally was. A lot of the barge board or trim up under the eaves is missing, but the brackets, etc., that are under the bay window or over the bay windows, those are all still there. We lost the barge board up under the eaves. It's never been there in my lifetime. This building, of course, served as the minister's home for the Methodist Church until 1963. We were a joint charge with Union, and Union decided the minister should be living in Union, and they built a modern ranch-style house for the minister. The Historical Society purchased the property in 2012, and we have found it very difficult to pay for all the maintenance on this building when it's of no use to us. So we are in the process of trying to sever it and sell it because we have a lot of people who'd love to buy the building. It is a very attractive home inside. And we will now move over to the church right next door, which is at 6089, and I will describe for you the church. You are now in front of what was the Sparta Methodist Church, and then later the Sparta United Church, and now it is the Sparta Church Museum and Cultural Center. There was originally a wooden chapel on this site, built in 1850, that stayed here till 1886, when they finally had raised enough money, they felt, to build a more substantial church. It is a very large church inside, holds 250 people. It had a steeple originally that held a bell. That steeple was hit by lightning and removed. But other than that, the church is virtually as it was back in its early days. The windows are the same, etc. Nothing has been changed on the building itself. The church was built, they collected money, and of course, after the church was built, several people who had promised money didn't follow through. So it took them a few years to pay it off, but they eventually did. It's a Gothic style building with the Gothic windows, very typical of churches of that period, and the manse had some Gothic windows in as well. It's built of yellow brick that came into popularity in the 1870s and lasted till into the 1890s. It's a much softer brick than the red brick, so it needs repointing frequently. The church closed in 2012, and that's when the Spartan District Historical Society bought it to preserve the building and turned the upstairs into a museum with a changing display. It's not a display about churches, it's just a display on some aspect of Sparta or our history. And the downstairs room is a beautiful room for holding events. So it's become our major event room for the community. We're going to head north now on, this is Quaker Road. We're going to head north of the Four Corners until you come to 6201, which is the Very House, north on Quaker Road. We're now at the Very House at 6201 Quaker Road. This is an interesting house. It's a Gothic style cottage, and you will see the Gothic or pointed arched window and very steep peaked gable. Those are very typical of Gothic style, but it also is a board and batten building, which means that the boards run vertically with the small batten boards over it. This is a much larger building than you realize, because from the road it looks very tiny, but you'll realize it goes back a long way. It has barge board, or some people call it gingerbread trim, up in that sharp peaked roof. Sparta was named in this house. Sparta was called the Corners in 1813 till 1834. And that was considered not a suitable name for a community that was going to get a post office. So Upper Canada requested, if we were going to get a post office, that we had to come up with a better name for the village. So a meeting was held of landowners in this house in 1834. The problem is a lot of people who weren't landowners showed up. And so they canceled the meeting because as far as they were concerned, the locals, of course, all men, only men were allowed to vote and only landowners. So they held a second meeting quietly without announcing it of just landowners that they had notified. Henry Yarwood, who was the one going to open the post office, had lived in a Sparta in the United States at one point, so he suggested that name. Sparta is a strange name for a Quaker community. Quakers are pacifists, and it is a very unusual name for a pacifist community. But the reason the name was popular was Greek names were very popular at that time. The town of Elmer nearby was called Troy at that time. And the little town of Corinth was just beyond Troy and to the north. And so they chose Sparta as the name for this community, and it has stuck. This house anyway is it's not in the Very family, but the Harveys bought it from the Verys, and it's been in the Harvey family now for about 150 years. We will now move on to across the road, the Esmond Smith house at 6188. We are now at what I call the Esmond Smith house. It was an early house of actually Hiram Smith. He owned several houses in Sparta that he left to various members of his family. Esmond Smith was one of his descendants. His family lived here for many years, and his parents as well, but then it is now owned by a different person. This is at 6188 Quaker Road. It was built in the 1850s. It's another one of the Israel Doan houses. You'll notice it's exactly the same as the other cottage style, Regency style cottages with a door that is set in with pilasters and a heavy entablature over the door and the 6/6 window panes. The shutters are no longer on this one, but it does have that heavy facet and soffia and the eave returns on the ends. So it's very similar, and it was another one that Israel Doan designed and built. We are now at the Alvin J. House at 6221 Quaker Road. This house was built in the 1880s and is a very typical of an Italianate style of home. It has the big brackets up under the eaves, the heavy eaves that come out in the bay window, the front door with the curved entablature above. That was very typical of the Italianate period. And the double door that you see on this one as well. Alvin J. was an important character in Sparta. The house then passed on to Dr. Lee Elliott and his wife, who were very involved in many aspects of Sparta, she being the organist of the church and he being a local doctor. We will now move on to the copper beech tree just to the north of this house on the corner of Quaker Road and North Street. I thought that you would like to see this incredible copper beech tree. We had two of them in Sparta. The one of them died years ago, but this one is still thriving on the corner of Quaker Road and North Street. in front of a fairly old house as well. But everyone cherishes this old copper beech. Trees have always been an important aspect of Sparta. You'll see also here a picture of the Sparta mile maple. This was a maple tree that lived and was in the woods, because of course this whole area was woods when the early settlers came. And when they were clearing for the road and it had been surveyed, this tree sat on the road, and they built the roadway around it because it was such a beautiful specimen of a sugar maple tree, and they wanted to keep it. So it was the Sparta mile maple, they called it. Was 1 mile from the four corners of Sparta. You could catch the stage here, you could mail your mail here, or you could get off the stage here as well. The stage always stopped on its way to Union and St. Thomas on its route every day at the Sparta Mile Maple. We value trees, and I'm going to move you on now. We're going to go up to the Quaker or Friends Meeting House, which is at 6387 Quaker Road. We are now at the Friends Meeting House at 6387 Quaker Road, and this house was built, it was the third meeting house for the village of Sparta. The Quakers built their first meeting house in this Quaker cemetery, and then that one was replaced by a larger one in the same location because they outgrew the size of that one. And then the third one was built here north of the village because many of the Quakers had settled to the north, up to 2 miles north. It was easier, it was more central to all of the Quakers or Friends. They did not like to be called Quakers, they were called the Friends. This is a typical style of the United States. This is how many of the meeting houses in the northern United States looked as well. And of course, the Quakers came up from the United States when they settled here. They came up to the Niagara region first and then here. You'll notice it has separate entrances. There are two entrances, one for men and one for women. Women held separate business meetings and the men held separate business meetings. But when they met for worship, they met together. There was no front on the inside of the Quaker Meeting House. It all faces toward the center so that everybody was equal in a Quaker meeting. And they meet in silence. They worship in silence, waiting for the Spirit of God to speak to them. And if the Spirit of God speaks to them and wants them to share something, they will get up very quietly and share what they believe the Spirit of God has asked them to share. They do not sing in a Quaker meeting. It's entirely in silence unless someone speaks. The Quakers of this meeting, though, did have a piano in the building, and they actually had a woman who was a Quaker who taught music lessons. So music was important, but just not part of worship. To this day, they will sing before worship, but never during worship. So they do have a songbook that is used. The meeting for worship is only held in what the left-hand end or the south end, and the north end now is more for business meetings and potluck dinners or whatever, because they have a small kitchen and they have a Sunday school room and washrooms there. The building actually was almost twice the size it is now. It used to extend to the west behind, out much larger, so that when they held, they called Quaker yearly meeting, that way people from New York State, Pennsylvania, and all parts of Ontario came to join them in their yearly meeting. And they hosted yearly meetings here, and the people would board with local Quakers or stay in the Mills Hotel. And it's remained an active meeting. This building was built in 1865, and the first one was built in 1820 in the cemetery. But it is a very typical New England style Quaker meeting house, and it is still an active meeting. They meet every Sunday for worship at 11, and anyone is welcome to attend to join them. It is also plain in color. Inside, it's all soft gray, so it's very restful and not distracting. And they believe that's important. From this one, we're going to move up now to the Moore House at 6545. You won't be able to see much from the road. You cannot drive in, but we will tell you about the Moore House. You are now at the road in front of 6545 Quaker Road, which is the old John Moore House. Now, it's very difficult to see. It's just to the north of the modern building, and they have turned the original house into a garage. Now, this was a very special house built in 1824 or 1825, and was a 5-bay Georgian style house made from shaped fieldstone and handmade brick from the actual site. They made the brick on the site, and the stones were all from the farm left over from the Ice Age when it deposited a lot of large stones in this area. The chimneys were built into the end walls, and there were two fireplaces both on the lower floor and on the upper floor and on both ends of this building, and that's how it was heated. There was a brick bake oven in the kitchen as well, and the windows were 12 over 12 window panes. It had heavy eave returns and it had stone coined corners. It was built into the hillside and it had interior gravity fed water supply from springs on the hillside. They actually had running water in this house with spigots in the 1820s. In 2008, the current owners built their new home on the front of it, so you are no longer able to see the details. You have to look at an old one. But the province did step in and they were made to keep all the outer walls of the building itself. John Moore, who built it, was one of the early Quaker families. We are now going to move on to the cobblestone house at 6738 Quaker Road. We are now in front of the cobblestone house, and we are very lucky because this house was restored a few years ago with all the stone. The stones were washed, and much of the one window that had been removed, it had been a door and had been removed, that was replaced again. So we're lucky that that happened. This house, begun in 1871 and completed in 1872, built by Amasa Chase for his nephew Isaac Chase. Amasa was 70 years of age when he built this. He came up from the United States to build this for his nephew. He had worked on the Erie Canal, which is where they learned how to do cobblestone. And if you visit the town of Paris in Ontario, you'll see several cobblestone buildings there as well. The only other ones that I know of in Ontario. The stones were picked out of Catfish Creek, and they had a board with two knot holes, a large knot hole and a small knot hole. If it went through the large one but wouldn't go through the small one, it was the right size stone to put in the walls. Can you imagine measuring all those stones? And it's laid out in a herringbone pattern. So the stones all slant to the north on one row, and the next row they slant to the south. So you have this lovely herringbone pattern. It has beautiful bargeboard trim on the eaves. And there were beautiful finials on the top of each of those pieces. There's only just the base of the finials left. The entrance door has side lights and a transom, and beautifully lets light into what was the hall where the major staircase was. It's a very large house inside with 5 beautiful bedrooms upstairs of a good size. The only windows that are left are the Palladian windows at the front that are original, and that's that one with the 3 and the little piece above. You'll notice that the coins are red and yellow brick, and there is a medallion on the south side of that front entrance. And on the south end of the gable, there is an obsidian rock in the middle, way up high, which if the sun shines on is just like a star. It's just brilliant. This house was, as I say, refurbished. You'll notice that the stone fence that was built originally with the house and had a walkway from that road right into the front door of the house is still there. Isaac Chase was a Quaker at the time. He later became a Mormon. His uncle, Amasa, came up from the States. Amasa liked Sparta so much that he sold his home in the States and he moved here and lived on the main street of Sparta. At the age of 80, he hand dug a basement under his own house and bricked it in. And he lived well into his 90s, and he was the basket maker in the village as well. You'll notice that there was a veranda on the part where the main front door is. That has been gone for many, many years, but we're very thankful that the house was refurbished about 5 years ago and is in beautiful condition now. We're going to move on to our last house now, which is the Cole Fish House at 7435 Quaker Road. We are now at the Cole Fish House at 7435, and this was our newest designated property in Sparta. This house was built in 1880. And you'll see it's made of yellow brick, and it's Italianate in style. Has a lot of features of the Italianate style, with the very heavy eave returns and the brackets under the eaves and all the different heights of the roof. And the chimney is in the very center of the house. It's very hard to see now, but it is still there.
And the porch, parts of it have been replaced, but they have always tried to follow the original pictures so that they keep it as true to its form as it was built. Now, it was built by W.B. Cole in 1880, and W.B. Cole's wife was Amelia Mills. John Mills was one of the original Quaker settlers, and he bought all four corners. This is at the corner of John Wise and Quaker, and he bought all four corners, built his own home. His son built one of the houses where the Delta Power is now. There was a house there as well. And this one, which is on the southwest corner. And John Mills, his son Samuel, owned this section. And then Samuel's daughter Amelia married W.B. Cole, and they built this home. They were Quakers. Descendants still live in the house, and they are still Quakers. This home was built by Amelia and W.B. Cole. It then passed to their son, Earl Cole. Earl passed it on to his daughter, Connie, who married a fish. That's where the fish came in. And their son, Alan, and his wife own the building now and co-own it with their son, Greg, and his family. So this has remained in the Cole family or the Mills family right from the very beginning. This has always been a part of the Mills property. And as I say, it was designated recently. It is a very expensive house to keep up, so we're very thankful that they were willing to designate it. And it is a beautiful home. We hope you have enjoyed your tour of Sparta. Those are all the buildings that on the driving tour that we have. And we also will be featuring a walking tour on our website that you can download. And we hope you enjoy visiting our historic village. Thank you.